Good morning, Bimblers. And you join me here at Dunham and Mersey. I'm hanging about with the deers. And today's Bimble takes us down the Bridgewater Canal in one of my funny little Mersey Cuts videos. We've got to stay local today because there's rail strikes, so we can't go anywhere exotic. Plus, that's coupled with the fact that Anthony Joshua's fighting tonight, and I want to get home and watch it. So we should stop messing about and bimble. Let's bimble. Behind me is a pub called the Swan with Two Nicks, and I thought it was one of those silly pub names where they spell something wrong in the name. We've got one of them in Warrington. It's called the Fiddle-ith Bag. Not the fiddle in the bag, and not the fiddle-inth bag, which would be Lancashire dialect, but the Fiddle-ith Bag. But I was incorrect. The name does actually mean the Swan with Two Nicks, rather than the Swan with Two Necks. Historically, the royal family have enjoyed eating swans. And in the 12th century, it was decreed that any unmarked swan was fair game for the royal family, and they could claim it as their own and eat it up because they thought they were delicious. If you think back to all those old paintings of great feasts and Henry VIII tucking into a big table full of food, you will have seen at one end of the table there would have always been a swan on it, and that's the swan that they would have been eating. It was only really the swans on the River Thames that this law really applied to, because they couldn't really police it anywhere else. They weren't going to patrol all the rivers and streams around the whole of the UK to make sure us scruffy lot weren't eating the swans. That was up until the 15th century, when the royal family got two companies involved, and they give them half ownership of all the swans in return for marking them and claiming them as the royal swans. Nowadays, the way that you mark a swan would be by putting a ring round its foot, but in those days they used to put a little nick on its beak. One nick on its beak meant that it was owned by the royal family and a company called Dyers, and two nicks on its beak meant that it was owned by the royal family and a company called Vintners. And that's where you get the name of this pub. It's the swan with 2 nicks on its beak, meaning that it was owned by the royal family and vintners. Both companies still exist, but I've got a sneaking suspicion that they're both the same company these days. And I don't think that they eat swans, because they're very fishy tasting apparently. However, a myth is that you can't eat swans because they're all owned by the royal family. Only the swans marked with a ring round their foot, or a nick in the beak in the olden days, could be classed as being owned by the royal family. They didn't own every swan, they just had the right to own every swan. Which really means that we could all eat swan now. Apparently the nicest tasting swans are the ones fed on oats, rather than being fed on fishes and frogs. You get a lot of meat on a swan, wouldn't you? Let's Bimble.
Washed in clean by a riverside. They told you the news. Kept so cold in the blackest tide. If only you knew. I've heard what they've said, ignored what I read, and look to the bright side. So here's to the bad times, forgotten in good lives. I won't let you down. I'll take off my shoes and dance to the good news. Broken smiles, no, they won't turn it round. So take off your shoes and dance to the good news. Left too long in the passing time. You know what you know to be true. Dim lit scenes of a better life.
We just walked through something called Spud Wood, which was all planted in the 1990s. And before it was planted, it was a potato field, hence the name Spud Wood. I've always wanted to have a walk around it, but I've always been on the other side of the canal. I wanted to have a sneaky little explore and see if I could have a sneaky camp here, and I think I can, so keep it under your hats. But we've walked to the other side of Spud Wood, so we're at the banks of the Bridgewater Canal again. Or should I call it the Bridgewater Canal 2? Really, it's the sequel to the original Bridgewater Canal. We've bimbled down the original Bridgewater Canal between Manchester and Worsley Delph. And it was the Earl of Bridgewater, who owned all the coal mines in Worsley, that commissioned the canals. And the original Bridgewater Canal was such a success that he asked James Brindley to build him another one, this time linking Manchester to Runcorn. It was calculated before they built the canal that moving a ton of coal from Worsley to Liverpool would cost 40 shillings by pack horse. And it would cost 12 shillings going by the Mersey and Irwell navigation. But if they built their own canal, they could send a ton of coal to Liverpool for only 6 shillings, and it would completely bypass the River Mersey and the River Irwell and get them straight into the River Mersey at its widest point and basically into the Irish Sea. This stretch of the Bridgewater Canal was opened in 1776, 2 years after James Brindley died, unfortunately. But most of the infrastructure and most of the design for the canal is all his. In fact, he overseen a lot of the building of it before he died. It cost £220,000 at the time, which in today's money would have been about £25 million. It's 41 miles long, and there are no locks. There's a lock to get you into the canal, and a lock to get you out of the canal. But along the whole of the 41 miles, there are no locks. It's what you call a contour canal. It's all very clever. That James Brindley had a bit of smarts up there, didn't he? It wasn't without its opponents. A Sir Richard Brooke of Norton Priory didn't want the canal anywhere near his property. He thought that all the boatmen would poach his game and wildfowl. And he argued that the canal should be no nearer than 1,000 feet away from his house, and that the boatmen couldn't moor up for the night within 3,000 feet of his house. He also said that the towpath had to be on the south side of the canal rather than on the north side, as it is for most of the length of the canal. If you really think about it, the Bridgewater Canal is one of the ultimate Mersey cuts. It's more akin to the railways or the roads, being that it's completely man-made. It doesn't follow any rivers. It's just a ditch that was dug by James Brindley for the Earl of Bridgewater. Let's bimble.
You know what you know to be true. Dim-lit scenes of a better life, spoken in loud tones to you. Well, I've heard what they've said, ignored what I read, and looked to the bright side. So here's to the bad times forgotten in good lives. I will let you down. I will let you down. I'll take off my shoes and dance to the good news. Broken smiles, but they will turn it round. Smiles, but they will turn it round. So take off your shoes and dance to the good news. Take off your shoes and dance to the good news. To the bad times forgotten in good lives. I will let you down. I will let you down. I'll take off my shoes and dance to the good news. Broken smiles, but they will turn it round. Smiles, but they will turn it round. So take off your shoes and dance to the good news. Take off your shoes and dance to the good news. Take off your shoes and dance to the good news.
This is the picturesque village of Thelwall. But back in olden times, it was Britain's smallest city, and it was all established by King Edward the Elder in 923 AD. He was the king of Mercia, and that's where we are at the moment. Mercia and Northumbria were split apart by the River Mersey, and the River Mersey used to wind its way through Thelwall here, and used to go all the way through Lymm before heading off to near Earlham and then to Stockport But they got rid of all the winding sections of the River Mersey here in Thelwall and replaced it with a ship canal. If you go to the end of something called Ferry Lane here in Thelwall, you reach something called the Penny Ferry, and that's the ferry that takes you over the Manchester Ship Canal. And that dates back to before the Ship Canal was there, when they had to cross over the River Mersey. In fact, the Manchester Ship Canal Company have to offer the ferry because it was a public right of way. The ferry service had been going over the River Mersey for so many years that it was necessary for people to get from one side to the other. And an Act of Parliament said that the ferry could never cost anything over 11.5 pence. And we don't have halfpennies. So it remains at 11 pence today. They've actually just got a new ferry over there. They've upgraded from an aluminium rowboat to a motorised ferry. Very posh. If you turn right at the end of Ferry Lane, there's a path that goes all the way down the Manchester Ship Canal to Lymm. And you can still see some of the remains of the River Mersey down there. And you pass under Thelwall Viaduct, under the M6. And once you get to the end of the path, you reach something called Statham Lane, which we spoke about before in my Mersey Cuts video number 2. We were at Statham Lane on the Rixton side. Then they built the Manchester Ship Canal through it. And then a great big landfill in the middle of it. So you wouldn't know that Statham Lane over in Rixton and Statham Lane over in Lymm were ever linked together. But they were. Let's bimble.
It's yours, just wait. You do your best along the way. But it's those arms that told me I don't care if it's yours or mine. Without you it's just a waste of time. You showed me from the start such inspirations need a heart to bring you round. It could be ours, big aspirations need a heart to hold you.
You join me in Grappenhall, and I'm stood in the grounds of St Wilfrid's Church. And it's my favourite kind of church because it's a church that was started up by Paley and Austin. We've spoke at length about Edward Graham Paley and all his works across Lancashire. And he's done a few at Warrington. He built a church in Walton, and he fixed up a church in Daresbury, where Lewis Carroll was born. Paley and Austin fixed the roof and did the floors of the church. And when they ripped up the floors, they found the foundations of the original church from Norman times, from the 11th century. And they found where the original chancel was, that's where the choir sings. And the original nave, that's where the normal people sit. And they found evidence that it would have something called an apse, which is sort of like a quarter sphere, like an archway on the wall, that would have featured a mural, no doubt, of St Wilfrid. But who is St Wilfrid? He was born in Northumbria in 633 AD, and he had a bit of a falling out with his stepmother. So he went to study under a man called Cudder on the island of Lindisfarne. And Lindisfarne is where Bishop Aidan set up his monastery. We spoke at length about Bishop Aidan because he's busy mates with King Oswald, another person we've spoke at length about. They went all around Northumbria, or Lancashire and Yorkshire as it is now, spreading the word of Christianity. St Wilfrid was a big fan of King Oswald, and in fact he was banished from Northumbria because he was such a big fan of him. He started saying that King Oswald's royal lineage had more right to the crown than the current king. That was King Edgefrith, and he didn't take too kindly to that. And St Wilfrid had to go and hide in Mersey, which is where we are now, south of the River Mersey. And he would have felt very welcome. He could have gone in the Ram's Head, that's a beautiful pub, or the Par Arms next to his church. They do a stunning cheese pie. He'd have been very happy here. Let's bimble.
It's my heart that told me I don't care, you just disagree. Without you it wasn't meant to be. You showed me from the start. Such inspirations need a heart to bring you round. It could be yours. Big aspirations need a heart to hold you. Heart to hold you. I don't care, you can say what you like. I'm a peace-loving person, but I know I'm right. It's as easy as right from wrong. I'm a lover, not a fighter, so I wrote this song. You showed me from the start. Such inspirations need a heart to bring you round. It could be yours. Big aspirations need a heart to hold you. Heart to hold you down from the start. Such inspirations need a heart to bring you round. It could be yours. Big aspirations need a heart to hold you. Heart to hold you down.
You join me a little bit down the canal from London Bridge in Stockton Heath. And London Bridge isn't called London Bridge because it's falling down. It's called London Bridge because it's on the old road that went to London. There's been a road going down to London there since Roman times. In fact, they found a lot of artefacts from the Roman era. They also found artefacts from the Roman era here on the canal. When they dug it, they found the foundations to 2 buildings. And they kept finding little glass beads, which were believed to be from jewellery. That intersection between a major road and a canal meant that a bit of a quay was built up. And that featured blacksmiths and warehouses and lots of industry. They used to run packet boats from the pub opposite, which is imaginatively titled the London Bridge for obvious reasons. And those packet boats were pulled by something called bank riders. When you think of canal boats going down the canal, you imagine them being drawn by horses. But you imagine those horses to be big lazy lumps that sort of lollop down the towpath. But the bank riders used to ride on top of the horses and gee them up and get them to gallop. And that meant that the packet boats would get into Manchester in record time. Apparently the bank riders had the cottages here in Stockton Heath. A lot of industry built up in Stockton Heath, and you wouldn't think it these days. It's just the posh part of Warrington now. It's where you go for a posh night out. But in those days, they had Coldwell's tool makers, and they turned into $1 million industry during the gold rush in America. They would build shovels there, stick them on canal boats, send them down to Liverpool on the Bridgewater Canal. From Liverpool, send them over to America up to the Rockies. And people would be digging for gold in them there hills. Probably the last great use of the canal was sending ammunition from the factories here in Warrington. My nan used to work in one of them. Again, they put them in the canal barges, send them down the Bridgewater into the River Mersey to Liverpool, where I guess they would put them on bigger boats, and send them to wherever they needed them, wherever they were fighting the Bosch. And speaking about fighting, Anthony Joshua's on tonight, so I best get going.